Blood-soaked sand. The stench of rotting corpses baking under a merciless sun. Your lips cracked and bleeding, tongue swollen from thirst. That armor you thought would protect you. Right now, it's cooking you alive, literally turning your body into a slow-roasted meal at 110 degrees. You're 3,000 miles from home. Half your friends are already dead, not from heroic battle wounds, but from the endless, humiliating horror of dysentery. You're squatting in the dirt for the 5th time today, weak and trembling, wondering if this is really what salvation looks like. That priest back in your village made it sound so glorious, didn't he? March to Jerusalem, fight the infidels, all your sins forgiven. Guaranteed entry to heaven. What he didn't mention was the screaming. The flies. The way your best friend looked at you yesterday before he died, confused, betrayed, like he couldn't understand why God would let this happen to someone fighting in his name. Welcome to the Crusades. Where faith meets reality, and reality doesn't care about your prayers. Before we dive deeper into this nightmare, do me a favor, if you're enjoying this journey through history's darkest corners, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. And seriously, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I love knowing there's someone in Tokyo having breakfast while someone in London is falling asleep to medieval horrors. Now, let's continue. November 27, 1095. A cold day in Clermont, France. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd that stretches as far as the eye can see. Nobles in their finest clothes. Knights in polished armor. Peasants in rough wool tunics. They're all here because word has spread that the Pope himself has something important to say. Urban is a skilled orator. He knows exactly what he's doing. He doesn't just speak, he performs. His voice rises and falls with practiced emotion. He gestures dramatically. He paints pictures with words. And the picture he paints is terrifying. He tells them about Jerusalem. The holy city. The place where Christ walked, where he was crucified, where he rose from the dead. The most sacred place in all of Christendom. And it's in the hands of Muslims. Urban describes, in graphic, horrifying detail, how Christian pilgrims are supposedly being tortured and killed. How churches are being desecrated. How the sacred sites of Christianity are being defiled by infidels. Most of what he's saying is exaggerated or outright false. Muslim rulers had generally allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem for centuries. But the crowd doesn't know that. They believe every word. Then Urban shifts tactics. He talks about the Byzantine Empire, the last Christian stronghold in the east, under siege by the Seljuk Turks. Emperor Alexios has begged for help. Christians are being slaughtered. The faith itself is under threat. It's time, Urban declares, for the warriors of Europe to stop fighting each other and unite against a common enemy. But Urban isn't stupid. He knows these men. Knights live for warfare. Combat is their profession, their identity. Simply appealing to religious duty might not be enough. So he offers them something more concrete. Something irresistible. Indulgence. Fight in this war, and all your sins, every single one, will be forgiven. Completely. Instantly. It doesn't matter what you've done. Murder, theft, adultery, lying, cheating, washed clean. The slate wiped. And if you die fighting? Immediate entry into heaven. No purgatory. No waiting. No judgment. Just straight to paradise. For medieval Christians who live in constant terror of hell, who confess their sins regularly and still lie awake at night worrying it's not enough, this is the ultimate deal. This is a guarantee of salvation. The crowd explodes. People are shouting, Deus vult. God wills it. They're tearing strips of cloth from their garments, fashioning them into crosses. Knights are pledging on the spot to join the crusade. The fervor is intoxicating, almost manic. Urban has tapped into something primal. A combination of religious fear, martial pride, and the desperate human need to believe that suffering has meaning, that violence can be righteous, that there's a way to guarantee your soul's safety. But here's what nobody in that crowd understands. What they're really signing up for. They're signing up for years of misery. For a journey that will test every limit of human endurance. For battles fought in conditions they can't imagine. For diseases they've never heard of. For psychological trauma that will haunt them forever. They're signing up to become killers. Not just soldiers fighting other soldiers, but participants in massacres. In atrocities. In acts that will stain their souls far more deeply than whatever sins they're trying to wash away. Urban knows some of this. He has to. He's not naive. But he also believes, genuinely believes, that this is necessary. That reclaiming Jerusalem justifies the cost. That God truly does will this. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing about the Crusades. They weren't launched by cynical villains who knew they were doing evil. They were launched by true believers who were absolutely convinced they were doing good. The crowd disperses, buzzing with excitement. Plans are being made. Families are being told. Preparations are beginning. And none of them, not the Pope, not the nobles, not the knights, not the peasants, none of them truly understand what they've just set in motion. They've lit a fuse that will burn for 2 centuries. That will consume hundreds of thousands of lives. That will reshape the relationship between Christianity and Islam for a millennium. All because of a speech. A very good speech, admittedly. But still, just words. Words that will lead to an ocean of blood. Before the official crusade even gets organized, before the nobles and knights finish their preparations, something unexpected happens. The people, peasants, poor folks, the desperate and dispossessed, they don't want to wait. They hear about the crusade and they think, why should this be just for the rich? Why should nobles get all the glory and salvation? Enter Peter the hermit. Peter isn't a military leader. He's not a strategist. He's not even particularly well educated. He's just a charismatic preacher with wild hair, a scraggly beard, and an intensity that people find mesmerizing. Peter travels through France and Germany, preaching about the crusade. And people follow him. Thousands of them. Some estimates put the number at 40,000 or more. Peasants mostly, but also priests, monks, women, children, elderly people. A massive, disorganized mob united by nothing except religious fervor and a vague belief that God will protect them. They have no supplies. No real weapons. No plan beyond, walk east and trust in God. This is a disaster waiting to happen. The People's Crusade sets out in the spring of 1096, months before the official military expedition. They march through Germany, and almost immediately things go wrong. Some of Peter's followers start asking themselves a question: why are we traveling thousands of miles to fight non-Christians when there are non-Christians right here? They're talking about Jews. What follows is one of the darkest chapters in an already dark story. As the People's Crusade moves through the Rhineland, Crusaders attack Jewish communities. Worms. Mainz. Cologne. Speyer. The violence is horrific. Entire families are slaughtered. Homes are burned. Synagogues are destroyed. Jewish communities that had existed for centuries are wiped out in days. Some Jews try to defend themselves. Others try to buy protection from local bishops or nobles. Sometimes it works. Often it doesn't. The Crusaders justify this by saying they're doing God's work. Killing infidels. Starting their holy mission right here at home. But really, it's about something simpler and uglier. Hatred. Greed. The opportunity to commit violence with the excuse of righteousness. This isn't unique to the People's Crusade. Throughout the Crusades, Jewish communities will be targeted again and again. The crusading movement unleashes a wave of anti-Semitic violence that will echo through European history for centuries. Eventually, what's left of the People's Crusade reaches Constantinople in August 1096. Emperor Alexios takes one look at this ragtag mob and knows they're doomed. He tries to convince them to wait. To camp outside the city until the professional armies arrive. To not do anything stupid. But Peter's followers are impatient. They've come this far. They're ready to fight. They don't want to wait for some fancy knights to show up and take all the glory. So they cross the Bosporus into Anatolia. Into Seljuk Turkish territory. And they start acting like conquerors. They raid villages. They steal food. They attack local populations, both Christian and Muslim. The Turks watch this chaos with bemused contempt. Then they decide to end it. Near a place called Civitat, the Turkish army ambushes the People's Crusade. It's not even a battle. It's a slaughter. The Crusaders have no military training, no discipline, no organization. They panic. They break and run. The Turks cut them down by the thousands. Some try to hide in an abandoned fortress. The Turks set it on fire. Some try to surrender. They're either killed or sold into slavery. In a matter of hours, the People's Crusade is destroyed. Of the 40,000 or so who started the journey, only a few thousand survive. Most of them are captured and enslaved. A handful manage to escape back to Constantinople. Peter the Hermit survives, ironically, because he'd gone back to Constantinople to ask for supplies before the ambush. His crusade is over before it really began. But here's the thing, the failure of the People's Crusade doesn't discourage anyone. If anything, it makes the upcoming official crusade seem more necessary. See what happens when untrained peasants try to fight. We need real warriors. Professional soldiers. Knights. The People's Crusade becomes a cautionary tale. An example of what not to do. But it's also a preview. A glimpse of what the Crusades will really be like. The violence against Jews shows how easily religious justification can be twisted to serve hatred and greed. The massacre at Civitat shows how little God cares about the size of your faith if you don't have proper military tactics. And the whole chaotic mess shows how the crusading movement attracts not just the pious and noble, but also the desperate, the violent, and the insane. The People's Crusade is written off as an aberration. A mistake made by ignorant peasants who didn't know any better. But really, it's just the Crusades in miniature. All the same elements are there: religious fanaticism, poor planning, brutal violence, and mass death. The only difference is that when knights do it, when nobles lead the armies, we call it history instead of tragedy. Though honestly, it's both. Let's talk about the actual journey. Because this is where most crusaders' glorious adventure turned into a waking nightmare. You're a French peasant. You've sewn a cross onto your tunic. You've said goodbye to your family, probably for the last time, though you don't fully grasp that yet. And now you're walking. Walking east. Toward Jerusalem. Do you know how far Jerusalem is from France? About 3,000 miles. 3,000 miles through foreign territory, hostile populations, mountains, deserts, and lands where nobody speaks your language. And you're walking. Every single mile. In the first few weeks, it's almost an adventure. You're with thousands of other pilgrims and soldiers. There's a sense of camaraderie. People sing hymns. Share food. Tell stories. You're on a holy mission. It feels meaningful. Then reality sets in. Your feet start to hurt. Not just sore, truly, deeply painful. Medieval shoes aren't designed for walking 3,000 miles. They wear out. They fall apart. Many crusaders end up walking barefoot, their feet bloody and blistered. The food situation becomes a problem almost immediately. The Crusader armies are massive, tens of thousands of people. They eat a lot. And they're passing through lands that can't support that many extra mouths. Sometimes you can buy food from locals. If you have money. If the locals are willing to sell to foreign invaders. Often they're not. So you forage. You hunt. You steal. And when there's nothing to steal, you go hungry. Hunger becomes a constant companion. Not the, I'm a bit peckish, hunger of missing lunch. Real hunger. The kind where your stomach cramps, your head pounds, and you think about food every single moment of every single day. Then there's the water. In Europe, water is everywhere. Rivers, streams, wells. You never really think about it. In Anatolia, in the Middle Eastern deserts, water is life. And it's scarce. The Crusader armies have to follow routes where water is available. They have to plan marches around reaching the next water source before people start dying. And people do start dying. Heat stroke drops men like flies. One moment they're walking, the next they're collapsed on the ground, convulsing, their skin burning to the touch. Many never get up again. Dehydration kills even more. Your tongue swells. Your lips crack and bleed. You can't produce saliva. Eventually, you become delirious, seeing things that aren't there, before you finally lose consciousness. But wait, aren't you wearing armor? Didn't you bring your protective gear? Yes. Which makes everything worse. Chain mail weighs 40 to 50 pounds. That's 40 to 50 pounds of metal that you're wearing in 100-degree heat. Metal that absorbs the sun's energy and transfers it directly to your body. Knights sometimes die from heat exhaustion without ever encountering an enemy. They literally cook inside their armor. Some Crusaders abandon their armor. They throw it away, deciding that the risk of attack is preferable to the certainty of heat death. And speaking of attacks, the Turks don't fight the way Europeans fight. European warfare is straightforward. Two armies meet. They line up. They charge at each other. There's a big melee. Eventually, one side wins. The Turks don't do that. They're mounted archers. They ride up, shoot arrows from horseback, and ride away before you can respond. They ambush supply columns. They poison water sources. They burn the countryside so the Crusaders find nothing but desolation. You never see it coming. You're marching along, exhausted and miserable, and suddenly arrows are raining down. Men are screaming. Horses are panicking. And by the time you organize a response, the attackers are gone. This psychological warfare is devastating. You're constantly on edge, constantly waiting for the next attack. You can't rest properly. You can't relax. The stress is overwhelming. And then there's dysentery. Oh, the dysentery. Bad water, spoiled food, poor sanitation, it all leads to intestinal infections. You develop severe diarrhea. You're cramping, in pain, constantly having to stop to relieve yourself. In severe cases, you see blood. You become dehydrated, which makes everything worse. You grow weak, unable to keep up with the army. If you can't keep up, you're left behind. And if you're left behind, you die. Either from the illness, from exposure, or from Turkish patrols that find you. The Crusader trail through Anatolia is lined with bodies. Abandoned corpses of men who couldn't go any further. No burial. No last rites. Just left where they fell. And you march past them, wondering if you'll be next. Weeks turn into months. The initial excitement is long gone. Now it's just putting one foot in front of the other. Surviving one more day. Making it to the next camp. The next water source. The next city. Some men desert. They slip away at night, trying to make it back home. Most don't succeed. They die in the wilderness or are captured by locals who have no sympathy for foreign invaders. But most Crusaders keep going. Not because they want to. Not because they still believe in the mission. But because they've come too far to turn back. Returning means crossing the same hostile territory again. At least forward, there's the hope, however faint, that Jerusalem is waiting. So you march. And you suffer. And you watch friends die. And you wonder what sin you committed to deserve this hell on earth. And you haven't even reached the Holy Land yet. You've survived the march. Somehow. Against all odds. You're still alive. Now comes the part that's somehow even worse, laying siege to a city. Let's use Antioch as our example, because Antioch is where the First Crusade nearly ended before it even really began. The Crusaders arrive at Antioch in October 1097. The city is massive. It has thick walls, strong fortifications, multiple gates, and a large, well-supplied garrison. The Crusader army surrounds the city. And then, they wait. That's what a siege is. Waiting. Trying to starve the enemy out. Cutting off supplies and hoping they surrender before you run out of resources yourself. Here's the problem, Antioch is too big. The Crusaders don't have enough men to completely surround it. The defenders can still bring in supplies through gates the Crusaders can't cover. So the people inside the city are eating normally. Meanwhile, you're outside, slowly starving. The surrounding countryside has already been picked clean. There's no food to forage. Supply convoys from distant areas are slow and vulnerable to attack. You're hungry. Always hungry. You start with short rations. A piece of bread. Some thin soup. Then the rations get shorter. And shorter. Men start eating their horses. Not the war horses, those are too valuable. But the pack animals, the ones carrying supplies. They're slaughtered and eaten. Then men start eating anything they can find. Grass. Leaves. Leather. There are accounts of Crusaders boiling old leather boots to make them soft enough to chew. And all of this is happening while it's raining. Winter in this part of Syria means cold, heavy rains. The Crusader camps turn into muddy swamps. Your tent leaks or collapses. You're sleeping in puddles. Your clothes are constantly wet. Disease spreads like wildfire. Pneumonia. Typhoid. Dysentery, always dysentery. Men are dying every single day. Not from battle. From disease, starvation, and exposure. The death toll is staggering. Hundreds per week. The Crusader army is slowly disintegrating outside the walls of Antioch while the defenders inside remain safe and fed. Morale collapses. Men are deserting by the dozens. Even nobles are giving up. Stephen of Blois, one of the Crusader leaders, sneaks away in the night. He abandons the crusade and goes home. Peter the Hermit, remember him? Survivor of the People's Crusade, tries to desert too. He's caught and brought back, humiliated. You're sitting in your muddy tent, sick, starving, watching friends die, and wondering, is this really what salvation looks like? Is this God's plan? Does God even care? The siege drags on for 8 months. 8 months of slow-motion horror. The Crusader leaders know they can't take the city by assault. The walls are too strong. They need a miracle. They get a traitor. Pyrrhus is an Armenian Christian serving as a guard captain inside Antioch. He's unhappy with the Turkish leadership. Or maybe he's been bribed. Or maybe he's just betting on the winning side. The sources aren't clear. What is clear is that he makes contact with Bohemond of Taranto, one of the Crusader leaders. He offers to let the Crusaders into the city through towers he controls. On the night of June 2, 1098, it happens. Bohemond leads a small group to Pyrrhus' towers. They climb up on ladders. Kill the guards. Open the gates. The Crusader army pours in. After 8 months of suffering, of starvation, of watching friends die, the Crusaders are inside the city. And they're angry. What follows is a massacre. The Crusaders kill everyone they find. Turkish soldiers. Civilians. Men, women, children. Nobody is spared. Houses are looted. Women are raped. The streets literally run with blood. It's a frenzy of violence. 8 months of pent-up rage and desperation exploding in a few hours of horror. The Crusaders' own chroniclers are shocked by the brutality. They write about it in disturbed tones, trying to reconcile what happened with their image of a holy war. But for the Crusaders actually doing the killing, it feels righteous. These are infidels. This is God's judgment. This is what they deserve. You're part of this. Maybe you personally kill someone. Maybe you just loot a house. Maybe you just stand there and watch. But you're complicit. This is what you've become. The Crusaders have captured Antioch. But their celebration is short-lived. Just days later, a massive Turkish relief army arrives. Led by Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. Suddenly, the Crusaders are trapped inside the city they just captured. Besieged by an army that vastly outnumbers them. You thought being outside the walls was bad? Try being inside with no food. The Crusaders had depleted the city's supplies during their rampage. Now they're starving inside the walls while a Turkish army waits outside. Men are eating horses. Then they're eating leather. Then grass. Some resort to cannibalism, though the chroniclers only mention this in horrified whispers. Disease runs rampant. The city is filled with rotting corpses from the hell. Actual hell. And you're trapped with no way out. June 7, 1099. After 3 years, of marching, fighting, starving, and dying, the Crusaders finally see it. Jerusalem. The city rises from the desert like something out of a dream. The walls. The towers. The dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Crusaders fall to their knees. Grown men weep. After everything they've endured, they've made it. They're here. For a moment, all the suffering seems worth it. All the death, all the pain, it led to this moment. Then reality sets in. They still have to capture the city. Jerusalem is heavily fortified. Thick walls. Strong gates. Multiple layers of defense. And it's garrisoned by Egyptian soldiers plus the local population. The Crusaders are exhausted. Depleted. They've lost thousands of men along the way. The army that finally reaches Jerusalem is a fraction of what left Europe. And they have no siege equipment. No catapults. No siege towers. Nothing. They'll have to build everything from scratch. But there's a bigger problem, there's no wood. The area around Jerusalem has been stripped bare. The defenders cut down every tree within miles. They've removed any material the Crusaders could use. So the Crusaders have to send expeditions miles away to find timber. These expeditions are dangerous and time-consuming. Meanwhile, they're camped outside Jerusalem in the middle of summer. The heat is unbearable. Water is scarce. Food is running low. Men are dying from heat stroke and dehydration. Every single day. The Crusaders know they're on a clock. If they don't take the city quickly, a relief army will arrive from Egypt. Then they'll be caught between the city's defenders and an Egyptian army. They'll be destroyed. So they work frantically. Building siege towers and battering rams from whatever timber they can scavenge. It takes weeks. Weeks of suffering in the heat. Weeks of watching men die. Weeks of wondering if they'll fail at the final hurdle. Finally, in mid-July, the siege engines are ready. July 13th, 1099. The assault begins. The Crusaders push their siege towers toward the walls. These are massive wooden structures, several stories tall, with a drawbridge at the top that drops onto the battlements. But getting them to the walls is incredibly dangerous. The defenders are throwing everything down. Arrows. Stones. Boiling oil. Burning torches. The Crusaders have covered the towers with wet animal hides to protect against fire. But the hides are drying out in the heat. Men are dying by the dozens. Shot down. Burned. Crushed by falling stones. The first assault fails. The towers can't get close enough. The defenders are too strong. The Crusaders pull back. Regroup. Try again the next day. July 14th. The second assault. This time they concentrate on a section of the northern wall. Inch by inch, while men die around them, they push a siege tower forward. The defenders fight desperately. They know if the Crusaders breach the walls, it's over. But finally, the tower reaches the wall. The drawbridge drops. Crusader soldiers charge across. The first man onto the wall is a Flemish knight named Lethold. He fights his way onto the battlements. More Crusaders follow. They establish a foothold. Then push along the walls, opening the way for more Crusaders. Meanwhile, another group smashes through a gate with a battering ram. Suddenly, Crusaders are pouring into Jerusalem from multiple points. The city is falling. What happens next is one of the worst atrocities of the medieval period. The Crusaders go berserk. They kill everyone. Muslim soldiers. Muslim civilians. Jewish residents. Men, women, children, elderly. Nobody is spared. The streets run with blood. This isn't metaphor. Contemporary accounts describe blood flowing ankle-deep. The Crusaders are in a frenzy. 3 years of suffering has turned into rage. They believe they're doing God's work. These are infidels who occupied the holy city. Killing them is righteous. Some Muslims take refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, hoping the Crusaders will respect the house of worship. The Crusaders storm the mosque and kill everyone inside. The floor is slick with blood. Jewish residents flee to their synagogue. The Crusaders lock the doors and set the building on fire. Everyone inside burns to death. The screams echo across the city. The massacre continues for days. The Crusaders loot every building. They desecrate mosques and synagogues. They destroy religious artifacts and burn books. When it's finally over, when the Crusaders have exhausted themselves with killing, they gather at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They kneel. They pray. They weep with joy. They thank God for their victory. They genuinely believe they've done something holy. Something righteous. The death toll is impossible to know precisely. Contemporary Muslim sources claim tens of thousands. Modern historians estimate between 3,000 and 10,000. Either way, it's a bloodbath that will poison Christian-Muslim relations for centuries. And here's the thing, if you were a Crusader, you participated in this. You weren't a bystander. Maybe you personally killed civilians. Maybe you just looted their homes. Maybe you just stood by and watched. But you were complicit. This is what the crusade became. Not a noble quest. Not a holy mission. A campaign of conquest and slaughter where the promise of salvation led to damnation. The Crusaders have captured Jerusalem. But at what cost? They've committed atrocities that will echo through history. They've created hatred that will last for generations. And they've proven that faith without morality is just violence with an excuse. Jerusalem is captured. Most Crusaders immediately go home. They've fulfilled their vows. They've seen the holy city. They've earned their spiritual rewards. Time to leave this nightmare and return to normal life. But some stay. A few thousand men who decide to remain in the Holy Land and build a Christian kingdom. They call it the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And it's one of the most precarious political entities in history. Think about the situation. You're a European knight in Jerusalem. You're surrounded by Muslim states that vastly outnumber you. Egypt to the south. Damascus to the north. Various Turkish emirates to the east. All of them want Jerusalem back. All of them see you as invaders who need to be expelled. Your supply lines stretch back to Europe, 3,000 miles away. Reinforcements take months to arrive, if they come at all. You're dependent on ships from Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa for trade and supplies. If those ships stop coming, you're cut off. And you're trying to rule a population that's mostly Muslim and Jewish. People who hate you. People who see you as occupiers. This is the reality of the Crusader states. They're not stable kingdoms. They're military outposts. Constantly under threat. Constantly struggling to survive. The Crusaders try to establish a feudal system like Europe. They divide the land into fiefs. Multiple layers of defense. But castles can't solve the fundamental problem. There aren't enough Crusaders. The Kingdom of Jerusalem can field maybe a few thousand knights at most. The surrounding Muslim states can field tens of thousands. The only reason the Crusader states survive is because the Muslims are divided. Fighting among themselves as much as they fight the Crusaders. But that won't last forever. Life in the Crusader states is strange. You have European knights living in Middle Eastern cities, trying to maintain their culture while adapting to the environment. They wear lighter armor because of the heat. They eat local foods. Some learn Arabic. Some marry local Christian women. A new culture is emerging. Neither fully European nor fully Middle Eastern. But the Crusaders remain a ruling minority. Separate from the majority population. They live in castles and fortified cities, only venturing out when necessary. They don't integrate. They occupy. And the military situation is always precarious. Muslim raids are constant. Caravans are ambushed. Villages are burned. The Crusaders develop tactics to deal with this. A network of castles that support each other. Mounted patrols. Treaties with some Muslim leaders, playing factions against each other. But it's exhausting. You can never relax. Never let your guard down. You're always on edge. Always waiting for the next attack. And the climate is brutal. European knights aren't used to Middle Eastern heat. Summer temperatures make wearing armor almost impossible. Water is always an issue. In Europe, water is abundant. Here, it's scarce. You have to manage it carefully. Armies can be defeated simply by denying them water access. Food is challenging too. Many European crops don't grow well here. You have to adapt, eating local food some Crusaders find difficult. There are accounts of Crusaders complaining, longing for the bread and beer of home. And then there's the psychological toll. You're far from home. Surrounded by enemies. Living in constant danger. Many Crusaders become deeply religious, spending hours in prayer, visiting holy sites, trying to find meaning in their suffering. Others become cynical. Brutal. Caring only about survival and personal gain. The Crusader states attract a rough crowd. Younger sons of nobles with no inheritance. Criminals fleeing justice. Adventurers seeking wealth and glory. These aren't always noble or pious individuals. They're often violent, greedy men who see the Holy Land as an opportunity. This creates internal problems. Disputes over land. Over titles. Over authority. The Crusader states are constantly torn by internal conflicts. Different factions fighting each other almost as much as they fight Muslims. And all of this is happening while the Muslim world slowly unites. Leaders like Zengi and his son Nur ad-Din are consolidating power. Bringing different Muslim factions under their control. They're building armies specifically designed to fight Crusaders. They're developing tactics to counter Crusader strengths. The Crusaders can see it happening. The Muslim world is getting stronger. The Crusader states are not. It's only a matter of time before a strong Muslim leader emerges who can unite the factions and launch a coordinated campaign to retake Jerusalem. That leader will be Saladin. And when he comes, the Crusader states will face their greatest crisis. Living in the Crusader states means living with fear. Constant, grinding fear. Fear of attack. Fear of siege. Fear of capture and slavery. Fear of disease. Fear that your supplies won't arrive. Fear that reinforcements won't come. Fear that everything you've built, this precarious Christian kingdom in the heart of the Muslim world, will collapse. And eventually, that fear will be justified. Because the Crusader states are living on borrowed time. They're a historical anomaly. A brief Christian presence in a region that will ultimately reject them. But for now, for a few decades, they persist. A testament to human stubbornness. Or human foolishness. Probably both. His name was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. We know him as Saladin. Born in 1137 in Tikrit, he came from a Kurdish military family and rose through the ranks through skill, ambition, and brilliant political maneuvering. By 1174, Saladin had become Sultan of Egypt and Syria. He'd united two of the most powerful Muslim states under his rule, something no leader had accomplished since the Crusades began. And he had one goal: retake Jerusalem. Saladin was different from previous Muslim leaders the Crusaders had faced. He was a brilliant military commander, yes. But he was also a skilled politician and diplomat. He understood that to defeat the Crusaders, he needed to unite the Muslim world. So he spent years building alliances, negotiating treaties, consolidating power. He portrayed himself as the defender of Islam. The leader who would finally expel the Christian invaders. The Crusaders watched his rise with growing alarm. They knew he was dangerous. More capable. More determined. More unified than anyone they'd faced before. In 1187, Saladin was ready. He assembled a massive army, perhaps 30,000 men, and marched toward the kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders responded by gathering every available knight and soldier. Roughly 20,000 men. It was the largest Crusader army ever assembled. The two armies met at a place called the Horns of Hattin, near the Sea of Galilee. And what happened there would change Crusader history forever. The Crusaders made a critical mistake. They left their fortified positions and marched across open country in the middle of summer. They were trying to relieve a castle that Saladin was besieging. It was a trap. Saladin had positioned his forces to cut the Crusaders off from water sources. The Crusader army found itself in the middle of barren landscape, in July heat, with no water. Think about that. 20,000 men in full armor in the desert in July with no water. Saladin's forces surrounded them and began a campaign of harassment. They didn't attack directly. They just kept the Crusaders pinned down under the burning sun. Slowly dying of thirst. The Crusaders tried to break through to water. They couldn't. Saladin's forces were too strong, too well positioned. The Crusader army was trapped. As night fell, Saladin's forces set fire to the dry grass around the Crusader camp. Smoke filled the air, making it even harder to breathe. The Crusaders spent the night in hell. Surrounded by fire and smoke. Dying of thirst. Knowing that tomorrow would bring the final battle. July 4, 1187. The Battle of Hattin. The Crusaders, desperate and dehydrated, tried to fight their way out. But they were exhausted. Disorganized. Outnumbered. Saladin's forces cut them to pieces. Thousands of Crusaders were killed. Thousands more were captured, including King Guy of Jerusalem and most of the Crusader nobility. It was the worst military disaster in Crusader history. Saladin was merciful to most prisoners. He ransomed the nobles. Released many Muslims to the death, were executed. All of them. Beheaded as a message. With the Crusader army destroyed, the kingdom of Jerusalem was defenseless. Saladin marched from city to city. Most surrendered without a fight. They knew resistance was futile. And then, in September 1187, Saladin arrived at Jerusalem. The city that Crusaders had captured 88 years earlier. The city where they'd massacred thousands. Now it was Saladin's turn. But Saladin didn't massacre the inhabitants. He offered terms. Christians could leave peacefully if they paid a ransom. Those who couldn't pay would be enslaved, but there would be no mass killing. The city surrendered on October 2, 1187. Saladin entered Jerusalem and immediately ordered the mosques cleansed and rededicated. The Crusader kingdom's most important city, the reason for the entire crusade, was back in Muslim hands. The news reached Europe like a thunderbolt. Jerusalem had fallen. The holy city was lost. The Crusader states were on the verge of collapse. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade. The Third Crusade. This time, 3 of Europe's most powerful kings took up the cross. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. Philip Augustus of France. Richard the Lionheart of England. The Crusade of Kings. Surely this would succeed. But even kings couldn't overcome the fundamental problems of crusading. Frederick Barbarossa drowned in a river in Turkey before even reaching the Holy Land. His army fell apart. Philip Augustus and Richard arrived and besieged Acre. They captured it after months, but Philip went home, sick and exhausted. Richard continued alone. He won several battles against Saladin, including a major victory at Arsuf. But he couldn't retake Jerusalem. Every time he marched toward the city, he realized the same thing: even if he captured it, he couldn't hold it. His army wasn't large enough. His supply lines too stretched. So Richard did something pragmatic. He negotiated. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to a treaty. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims could visit freely. It wasn't victory. But it wasn't total defeat either. Richard went home. The Third Crusade ended. Jerusalem was still in Muslim hands. The Crusader state survived, but barely. Reduced to a narrow coastal strip. Dependent on European support. Constantly under threat. The age of Crusader dominance was over. Saladin had proven what the Crusaders feared: a united Muslim world could defeat them. And Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands for the next 730 years. If you thought the Crusades couldn't get any worse, any more chaotic, any more morally compromised, let me tell you about the Fourth Crusade. This is where the entire crusading movement reveals itself for what it really is. A vehicle for greed and political ambition dressed up in religious language. The Fourth Crusade was called by Pope Innocent III in 1198. The goal: retake Jerusalem. But this time, the strategy was different. Instead of marching to the Holy Land, they'd attack Egypt first. Conquer Egypt, and Jerusalem would follow. Actually a smart strategy. But it required ships. Lots of ships. The Crusaders didn't have a navy. So they made a deal with Venice. The Venetians would provide ships to transport the Crusader army to Egypt. In exchange, the Crusaders would pay 85,000 marks, an enormous sum. The Crusaders agreed, confident they could raise the money. They couldn't. When the Crusader army assembled in Venice in 1202, they'd only raised about 51,000 marks. They were 34,000 marks short. The Venetians, led by their elderly but shrewd Doge Enrico Dandolo, had a problem. They'd built a fleet specifically for this crusade. They'd invested enormous resources. And now the Crusaders couldn't pay. Dandolo proposed a solution. The Crusaders could work off their debt by helping Venice with a problem. The city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast had rebelled against Venetian control. If the Crusaders would help recapture Zara, Venice would defer payment. There was one problem: Zara was a Christian city. under the protection of the King of Hungary, who had himself taken Crusader vows. Attacking Zara meant Crusaders attacking fellow Christians. Pope Innocent III explicitly forbade it. He sent letters warning that anyone who attacked Zara would be excommunicated. But the Crusaders were desperate. They needed those ships. So they attacked anyway. Zara fell in November 1202. The Crusaders sacked a Christian city, killing Christians, in the name of a crusade to fight Muslims. The Pope excommunicated the entire Crusader army. But it got worse. Much worse. While in Zara, the Crusaders received a visit from Alexios Angelos, a Byzantine prince. Alexios had been overthrown. His father, the Byzantine emperor, had been deposed and blinded by Alexios's uncle. Alexios wanted his throne back. And he was willing to pay. He made the Crusaders an offer, help him reclaim the Byzantine throne, and he'd pay them 200,000 marks. He'd provide troops and supplies for the crusade to Egypt. And he'd reunite the Eastern Orthodox Church with Rome. It was too good to be true. And it was. But the Crusaders, desperate for money, agreed. In June 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived at Constantinople. The greatest Christian city in the world. The capital of the Byzantine Empire. The bulwark of Christianity against Islam for centuries. And the Crusaders were there to attack it. The Byzantines were horrified. They'd asked for help against the Turks, and instead they got a Crusader army demanding regime change. The reigning emperor fled. The Crusaders installed Alexios IV on the throne. But Alexios IV couldn't deliver on his promises. He didn't have 200,000 marks. The Byzantine treasury was depleted. And the Byzantine people hated him for bringing Crusaders to their city. Riots broke out. In January 1204, Alexios IV was overthrown and murdered. A new emperor, Alexios V, took power and told the Crusaders to leave. The Crusaders were furious. They'd been promised payment. They'd been promised support. Now they had nothing. So they made a decision that would echo through history. They would conquer Constantinople. They would sack the greatest Christian city in the world. In April 1204, the Crusader army attacked Constantinople. The city's defenses, which had held against countless Muslim sieges, fell to a Christian army. The Crusaders breached the walls and poured into the city. What followed was one of the worst sacks in history. The Crusaders looted everything. Churches. Monasteries. Palaces. Homes. They stole gold, silver, jewels, religious relics, artwork. Anything of value. They destroyed what they couldn't carry. They burned libraries. They smashed priceless artifacts. They raped and murdered. They desecrated churches. They melted down golden icons for their metal. They stole the bronze horses from the hippodrome and shipped them to Venice, where they still stand today. The sack of Constantinople lasted 3 days. When it was over, Europe from Islam for 800 years, was crippled. The Crusaders divided up the Byzantine Empire among themselves. They created the Latin Empire of Constantinople, a Crusader state in the heart of the Byzantine world. It would last less than 60 years before the Byzantines recaptured their capital. But the damage was done. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. And the crusade to Egypt? It never happened. The Crusaders had gotten distracted by the opportunity to loot Constantinople. They'd forgotten about Jerusalem. About fighting Muslims. About the entire purpose of the crusade. Pope Innocent III was appalled. He'd called a crusade to fight Islam, and instead the Crusaders had destroyed the Byzantine Empire. The Fourth Crusade revealed the crusading movement for what it had become, a tool of conquest and greed, where religious justifications were just window dressing. It was a disaster for Christianity. It permanently weakened the Byzantine Empire, making it easier for the Ottoman Turks to eventually conquer it in 1453. It deepened the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. And it destroyed any remaining moral authority the crusading movement had. After the Fourth Crusade, nobody could pretend anymore that crusades were about defending Christianity. They were about power, wealth, and politics. The religious rhetoric was still there. But nobody really believed it anymore. Let's talk about what really killed crusaders. Not swords. Not arrows. Not glorious combat. Disease. If you were a crusader, you were far more likely to die from disease than from a Muslim weapon. Far more likely. Medieval understanding of disease was primitive. People believed in the theory of humors, the idea that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. They didn't understand germs. Bacteria. Viruses. They didn't know about sanitation or hygiene the way we do. So when you put tens of thousands of people together in crowded camps with poor sanitation, limited clean water, and no understanding of how disease spreads, you create the perfect conditions for epidemics. Dysentery was the biggest killer. It's a bacterial infection of the intestines that causes severe diarrhea, often bloody. In the medieval period, with no antibiotics, dysentery was often fatal. You'd become dehydrated. Weak. Eventually you'd die. And dysentery spread like wildfire through Crusader camps. The sanitation was terrible. People would relieve themselves wherever they could, often near water sources. The water would become contaminated. People would drink it. And the disease would spread. Contemporary accounts describe Crusader camps where hundreds of men were dying every day from dysentery. The smell was overwhelming. The suffering was immense. And there was nothing anyone could do except try to stay hydrated and hope. Typhoid fever was another major killer. Also spread through contaminated water. It causes high fever, weakness, abdominal pain. Like dysentery, it was often fatal in the medieval period. Then there was malaria. Spread by mosquitoes. The Crusaders didn't know about mosquitoes as disease vectors. They just knew that people who camped near swamps often got sick with recurring fevers. Malaria could kill you. But more often it would just make you chronically ill, weakening you and making you vulnerable to other diseases. Scurvy was a problem on long sea voyages. It's caused by vitamin C deficiency and leads to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death. And then there were wound infections. In an era before antibiotics, even a minor wound could become infected and kill you. A cut from a sword. An arrow wound. Even a blister that got infected. Any of these could lead to sepsis and death. The Crusaders had some medical knowledge. They had physicians and surgeons. But their treatments were often ineffective or harmful. Bloodletting, deliberately draining blood from a patient, was a common treatment that probably killed more people than it saved. They did have some effective treatments. They used wine to clean wounds, which helped because the alcohol had antiseptic properties. They used honey as a wound dressing, which helped because honey has antibacterial properties. But they didn't understand why these treatments worked, so they couldn't apply the principles consistently. The heat made everything worse. In the Middle Eastern summer, dehydration was constant. Heat stroke killed many Crusaders. And the heat accelerated the spread of disease as bacteria thrived in the warm conditions. The Crusaders tried to adapt. They learned to boil water before drinking it, though they didn't understand why. They learned to avoid camping near stagnant water. They learned to bury their dead quickly. But these measures were only partially effective. Disease remained the biggest killer throughout the Crusades. Some estimates suggest that for every crusader who died in combat, 3 or 4 died from disease. And disease didn't discriminate. It killed nobles and peasants. Knights and foot soldiers. The pious and the cynical. It didn't matter how brave you were, how skilled with a sword, how strong your faith. Disease could kill you just as easily as it killed the weakest member of the army. This is one of the harsh realities of the Crusades. The Crusaders weren't just fighting Muslims. They were fighting an invisible enemy they didn't understand and couldn't defeat. If you were a crusader, you lived with constant fear of disease. You watched friends sicken and die. You wondered if you'd be next. And if you did get sick, your options were limited. You could try to tough it out. You could seek help from a physician who might bleed you or give you herbal remedies that probably wouldn't help. Or you could pray, asking God to spare you, promising to be a better Christian if you survived. Many crusaders made deathbed confessions, convinced they were dying as punishment for their sins. They'd ask for last rites, receive communion one final time, and then die in a tent thousands of miles from home, surrounded by strangers. This was the reality of crusading. Not glorious battles and heroic deeds, but slow, miserable deaths from diseases nobody understood and nobody could cure. And then there was the psychological impact. Imagine you survive. You make it home. But you're not the same person who left. You've seen things. Done things. Witnessed horrors that give you nightmares. Medieval people didn't have a concept of PTSD. But they recognized that war changed people. Chronicles mention crusaders who returned home melancholy or troubled in spirit. Some became monks, seeking solace in religious life. Others became violent, unable to readjust to peaceful society. The things crusaders witnessed and did would haunt anyone. The massacres. The atrocities. The countless deaths. Even if you tried to justify these actions as necessary, as God's will, some part of you had to know they were wrong. And there was the disillusionment. You'd been promised this was a holy mission. That God would protect you. Chaos and brutality. You'd seen leaders motivated by greed more than faith. How do you reconcile that? Some crusaders lost their faith entirely. Others doubled down, becoming even more religious. And then there was the guilt. If you survived when so many died, you might feel guilty. Why did you live when your friends didn't? Or if you'd done things you weren't proud of, killed civilians, looted churches, participated in atrocities, you'd carry that guilt forever. The medieval church offered confession and penance. But could a few prayers really erase the memory of what you'd done? For many crusaders, the answer was no. They carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. The Crusades broke people. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And there was no support system. No therapy. No counseling. You were expected to just get on with your life. To pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. You'd seen things most people couldn't imagine. And you had to deal with it alone. So let's bring this all together. Let's talk about why you, specifically you, wouldn't survive the Crusades. First, the physical challenges. You're not prepared for the kind of hardship the Crusades demanded. You're used to climate control. Comfortable beds. Regular meals. The Crusaders marched 20 miles a day in armor in extreme heat with limited food and water. Could you do that for months while sick with dysentery? You're not used to violence. You've probably never been in a real fight, let alone a medieval battle where people are trying to kill you with swords and arrows. The psychological shock of combat, the fear, the adrenaline, the chaos, would overwhelm you. You don't have the skills. Medieval crusaders were trained from childhood in weapons, in riding horses, in warfare tactics. You have none of that training. In battle, you'd be helpless. You don't have the mindset. Medieval people accepted suffering and death in ways modern people don't. They believed intensely in the afterlife, in divine judgment. You probably don't share those beliefs with the same intensity. When things got hard, when people around you started dying, you'd want to quit. But there was no quitting. You were 3,000 miles from Europe, surrounded by enemies. No way back except forward. The diseases would kill you. You have no immunity to the diseases that ravaged Crusader camps. Dysentery. Typhoid. Malaria. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics, you'd probably die. The heat would kill you. You're not acclimated to Middle Eastern temperatures. The first time you tried to march in full armor in 110-degree heat, you'd collapse from heatstroke. The food would make you sick. Medieval food was rough, often spoiled or contaminated. Your modern digestive system wouldn't handle it well. The water would kill you. Medieval crusaders drank from rivers and wells that were often contaminated. You'd get dysentery or typhoid and die. The psychological trauma would break you. Even if you somehow survived the physical challenges, the things you'd witness would traumatize you. The violence. The suffering. The atrocities. You'd develop PTSD, depression, anxiety. And with no treatment available, you'd just have to live with it. The other crusaders would be a problem. These weren't nice people. They were medieval warriors. Many violent, brutal men who saw nothing wrong with killing, looting, and raping. You'd be surrounded by people whose values would horrify you. The language barrier would be huge. You don't speak medieval French, German, or Latin. You couldn't communicate with fellow crusaders or locals. You'd be isolated. Unable to understand orders. Unable to ask for help. The religious fanaticism would disturb you. The Crusaders believed they were doing God's work. That killing Muslims was righteous. That any atrocity was acceptable. You probably don't share that worldview. You'd be disturbed by things done in the name of religion. But you couldn't speak out. Questioning the crusade was heresy. The lack of modern conveniences would drive you crazy. No phones. No internet. No electricity. No running water. No toilets. No showers. No coffee. No painkillers. No antibiotics. You'd be living in conditions that would seem unbearable. The boredom would be crushing. Medieval life was slow. Lots of waiting. Lots of marching. Lots of sitting around camp with nothing to do. No books. No entertainment. Just endless hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. The uncertainty would be maddening. You'd never know what was happening. No news from home. No updates on the Crusades' progress. You'd be living in constant uncertainty. The lack of control would be frustrating. You'd have no say in what happened. You'd follow orders. Go where you were told. Fight when commanded. Your life would be entirely in the hands of leaders who might be incompetent, corrupt, or insane. You'd be a pawn with no agency. No autonomy. No control over your fate. And finally, the futility would demoralize you. Even if you somehow survived all of this, even if you made it to Jerusalem, you'd realize the crusade was pointless. That the promises were lies. That you'd suffered for nothing. That realization would break whatever spirit you had left. So no, you wouldn't survive the Crusades. Almost nobody did. Not really. Even the ones who made it home alive were changed. Broken. Traumatized. The Crusades destroyed people physically, mentally, emotionally, and economically. And that's the truth about the Crusades that doesn't get told often enough. They weren't glorious adventures. They weren't noble quests. They were brutal, miserable campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of people and accomplished almost nothing of lasting value. The Crusades were sold as a holy mission. But they were really just wars of conquest dressed up in religious language. Driven by political ambition, economic greed, and religious fanaticism. And the people who suffered most were the ordinary crusaders. The men who believed the promises and paid the price. Today we look back at the Crusades and see them for what they were. A tragic mistake. A dark chapter in human history. A cautionary tale about what happens when religious fervor overrides reason and compassion. The Crusades didn't save Christianity. They didn't reclaim the Holy Land. They didn't accomplish any of their stated goals. What they did was kill hundreds of thousands of people, destroy countless communities, and create centuries of bitterness. And if you had been there, if you had taken up the cross and marched to Jerusalem, you wouldn't have survived. The journey would have killed you. Or the battles. Or the diseases. Or the heat. Or the despair. The Crusades were hell on earth. And that's why you'd never survive them. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. If this opened your eyes to the reality behind the romanticized version of the Crusades, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's brutal truths. Drop a comment and let me know, what part of this story shocked you the most? What would you want to hear about next? Until next time. Chaos and brutality. You'd seen leaders motivated by greed more than faith. How do you reconcile that? Some crusaders lost their faith entirely. Others doubled down, becoming even more religious. And then there was the guilt. If you survived when so many died, you might feel guilty. Why did you live when your friends didn't? Or if you'd done things you weren't proud of, killed civilians, looted churches, participated in atrocities, you'd carry that guilt forever. The medieval church offered confession and penance. But could a few prayers really erase the memory of what you'd done? For many crusaders, the answer was no. They carried their trauma for the rest of their lives. The Crusades broke people. Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. And there was no support system. No therapy. No counseling. You were expected to just get on with your life. To pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't normal. You'd seen things most people couldn't imagine. And you had to deal with it alone. So let's bring this all together. Let's talk about why you, specifically you, wouldn't survive the Crusades. First, the physical challenges. You're not prepared for the kind of hardship the Crusades demanded. You're used to climate control. Comfortable beds. Regular meals. The Crusaders marched 20 miles a day in armor in extreme heat with limited food and water. Could you do that for months while sick with dysentery? You're not used to violence. You've probably never been in a real fight, let alone a medieval battle where people are trying to kill you with swords and arrows. The psychological shock of combat, the fear, the adrenaline, the chaos, would overwhelm you. You don't have the skills. Medieval crusaders were trained from childhood in weapons, in riding horses, in warfare tactics. You have none of that training. In battle, you'd be helpless. You don't have the mindset. Medieval people accepted suffering and death in ways modern people don't. They believed intensely in the afterlife, in divine judgment. You probably don't share those beliefs with the same intensity. When things got hard, when people around you started dying, you'd want to quit. But there was no quitting. You were 3,000 miles from Europe, surrounded by enemies. No way back except forward. The diseases would kill you. You have no immunity to the diseases that ravaged Crusader camps. Dysentery. Typhoid. Malaria. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics, you'd probably die. The heat would kill you. You're not acclimated to Middle Eastern temperatures. The first time you tried to march in full armor in 110-degree heat, you'd collapse from heatstroke. The food would make you sick. Medieval food was rough, often spoiled or contaminated. Your modern digestive system wouldn't handle it well. The water would kill you. Medieval crusaders drank from rivers and wells that were often contaminated. You'd get dysentery or typhoid and die. The psychological trauma would break you. Even if you somehow survived the physical challenges, the things you'd witness would traumatize you. The violence. The suffering. The atrocities. You'd develop PTSD, depression, anxiety. And with no treatment available, you'd just have to live with it. The other crusaders would be a problem. These weren't nice people. They were medieval warriors. Many violent, brutal men who saw nothing wrong with killing, looting, and raping. You'd be surrounded by people whose values would horrify you. The language barrier would be huge. You don't speak medieval French, German, or Latin. You couldn't communicate with fellow Crusaders or locals. You'd be isolated. Unable to understand orders. Unable to ask for help. The religious fanaticism would disturb you. The Crusaders believed they were doing God's work. That killing Muslims was righteous. That any atrocity was acceptable. You probably don't share that worldview. You'd be disturbed by things done in the name of religion. But you couldn't speak out. Questioning the crusade was heresy. The lack of modern conveniences would drive you crazy. No phones. No internet. No electricity. No running water. No toilets. No showers. No coffee. No painkillers. No antibiotics. You'd be living in conditions that would seem unbearable. The boredom would be crushing. Medieval life was slow. Lots of waiting. Lots of marching. Lots of sitting around camp with nothing to do. No books. No entertainment. Just endless hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. The uncertainty would be maddening. You'd never know what was happening. No news from home. No updates on the Crusades' progress. You'd be living in constant uncertainty. The lack of control would be frustrating. You'd have no say in what happened. You'd follow orders. Go where you were told. Fight when commanded. Your life would be entirely in the hands of leaders who might be incompetent, corrupt, or insane. You'd be a pawn with no agency. No autonomy. No control over your fate. And finally, the futility would demoralize you. Even if you somehow survived all of this, even if you made it to Jerusalem, you'd realize the crusade was pointless. That the promises were lies. That you'd suffered for nothing. That realization would break whatever spirit you had left. So no, you wouldn't survive the Crusades. Almost nobody did. Not really. Even the ones who made it home alive were changed. Broken. Traumatized. The Crusades destroyed people physically, mentally, emotionally, and economically. And that's the truth about the Crusades that doesn't get told often enough. They weren't glorious adventures. They weren't noble quests. They were brutal, miserable campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of people and accomplished almost nothing of lasting value. The Crusades were sold as a holy mission. But they were really just wars of conquest dressed up in religious language. Driven by political ambition, economic greed, and religious fanaticism. And the people who suffered most were the ordinary Crusaders. The men who believed the promises and paid the price. Today we look back at the Crusades and see them for what they were. A tragic mistake. A dark chapter in human history. A cautionary tale about what happens when religious fervor overrides reason and compassion. The Crusades didn't save Christianity. They didn't reclaim the Holy Land. They didn't accomplish any of their stated goals. What they did was kill hundreds of thousands of people, destroy countless communities, and create centuries of bitterness. And if you had been there, if you had taken up the cross and marched to Jerusalem, you wouldn't have survived. The journey would have killed you. Or the battles. Or the diseases. Or the heat. Or the despair. The Crusades were hell on earth. And that's why you'd never survive them. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. If this opened your eyes to the reality behind the romanticized version of the Crusades, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's brutal truths. Drop a comment and let me know, what part of this story shocked you the most? What would you want to hear about next? Until next time.